He woke up to the sound of the wind rattling the old wooden shutters. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the heater. He sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor, feeling the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. It had been months since he returned home, but it still felt like he had never left the battlefield. The memories were fresh, uninvited guests that entered without warning, leaving him drained and restless. His small apartment was sparsely decorated. A few photographs hung on the walls showing him in uniform, smiling alongside other soldiers. Those smiles seemed like someone else's now, distant and almost unreachable. On the table by the window, a single cup of coffee had gone cold. He hadn't touched it. He couldn't focus on anything these days. The days bled into each other. A gray monotony filled with silence and the occasional whisper of memories he couldn't escape. Outside, neighbors went about their lives. Children played in the street, their laughter echoing in the narrow alleyways. He felt a pang of longing and sorrow, wishing he could be a part of that world, wishing the lightness of life could touch him too. But his grief weighed heavily, a shadow that seemed permanent. The death of his closest friend during deployment had changed everything. That loss gnawed at him every day, leaving a hollow space that nothing could fill. He tried to keep busy, filling his days with chores, exercise, and small tasks, but nothing seemed to help. Every sound, every unexpected knock at the door triggered tension in his body. His nerves were raw, sensitive to the world around him. The smallest noise could set him off, making him feel as if danger was lurking behind every corner. He felt trapped in his own mind, isolated and misunderstood. One evening, he was sitting on the couch staring at the muted television. The flickering images did nothing to distract him. Memories of the battlefield came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. The screams, the chaos, the faces of friends lost forever, they all crowded his mind. He tried to push them away, but they refused to leave. He felt the familiar surge of anger and sadness rising within him, a storm he could not control. That night, a neighbor noticed the light in his apartment burning late. Concerned, she called the local authorities to check on him. The police arrived quietly at first, knocking gently on the door. He hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. When he opened the door, the sight of uniformed officers made his heart race. Memories of tense situations and conflicts flashed through his mind, putting him on edge. The officers tried to speak calmly, explaining they were there to make sure he was okay. But every word felt like an intrusion, every movement a threat. He stepped back, his hands trembling, and tried to explain that he was fine. His voice was shaky, betraying the turmoil inside. The officers did not understand the depth of his grief, the invisible wounds that shaped his every thought and action. Their questions felt probing, their presence overwhelming. As the conversation continued, tension built. He felt trapped, cornered by people who meant well but could not see the world through his eyes. His mind raced with memories of conflict, of situations where trust could mean life or death. The officers, unaware of the full story, took cautious steps trying to de-escalate what they thought was a potential danger. But the misunderstandings only made things worse. He flinched at sudden movements, reacted defensively to the tone of voice he perceived as sharp. Fear and grief collided, creating a storm of emotion too complex to explain in words. Eventually, the officers decided to step back, leaving the apartment after taking basic notes and assuring him that help was available if needed. He closed the door slowly, feeling a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief that the confrontation was over, despair that no one truly understood him, that the world seemed to operate in a way that did not account for his pain. In the quiet that followed, he sank into the couch feeling utterly alone. The police had left, but the feelings they stirred within him remained. He thought about his friend, about the bond they had shared, and about the emptiness left behind. The grief was suffocating, and he wondered how he would survive each day without the support he so desperately needed. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the police visit over and over in his mind. Every gesture, every word was analyzed, dissected, and reinterpreted through the lens of his trauma. He felt misunderstood, judged, and exposed in a way that made him retreat further into himself. His body ached from the tension, his mind ached from the memories, and his heart ached from the loneliness that seemed unending. As dawn approached, he walked to the window and looked out at the city waking up. People moved with purpose, unaware of the battles waged behind closed doors. He wanted to reach out to find someone who could understand, but the fear of rejection held him back. He knew he could not face the world alone. Yet the thought of explaining himself to someone who could not truly understand seemed impossible. He remembered his time in service, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. Here, in the quiet of his apartment, he felt the stark contrast. The world outside was moving, thriving, and alive, while he felt frozen, trapped in a loop of grief and isolation. The memories of loss were relentless, and the thought of moving forward seemed daunting. That morning he made himself a cup of coffee, though he had no appetite. The ritual was a small comfort, a thread connecting him to normalcy. As he sipped the bitter liquid, he tried to steady his breathing, to find a sense of calm in the chaos of his mind. He looked at the photographs on the wall, at the smiling faces of comrades, and allowed himself a brief moment of remembrance, a fleeting connection to happier times. But the peace was fragile. Every sound, every unexpected movement, reminded him of the tension and fear that still lingered. The world had changed, and he had changed. He felt like a stranger in his own life, struggling to reconcile the past with the present. The weight of grief was heavy, and he realized he could not bear it alone for much longer. Little did he know, help was on the way, not the kind he had experienced before, not the authority-driven kind, but a kind that came from understanding, shared experience, and genuine compassion, someone who could see past the grief, past the fear, to the person who still had strength, courage, and the capacity to heal. It was a glimmer of hope, faint but real, waiting to reach him in a way that would change everything. For now, he sat in silence, the wind outside whispering against the windows, the city slowly waking up and the weight of grief pressing down. But somewhere deep inside, a small spark flickered. It was fragile, easily extinguished by doubt and fear, but it was there, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, connection, understanding, and hope could arrive when least expected. The morning after the police visit, he woke up feeling a heaviness he could not shake. The apartment was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive. Every sound from outside, the distant hum of traffic or the chirping of birds, made him tense. He moved slowly, mechanically, as if his body was functioning without his full attention. The memory of the confrontation lingered in his mind, twisting in ways that made his chest tighten. He wandered into the kitchen, staring blankly at the kettle. The act of boiling water seemed impossibly complex in his state. Thoughts of his friend, the one he had lost, came flooding back. Every detail, from the laugh they shared to the plans they made, was etched deeply in his memory. It was painful, almost unbearable. He could feel tears welling up, but he swallowed them, unsure of why he still tried to hold everything inside. The phone rang, startling him. He jumped, heart racing. It was a neighbor, checking in after hearing about the police visit. She spoke gently, her voice kind, but even kindness felt like a threat sometimes. He muttered a few words, assuring her he was fine, but the lie felt heavy on his tongue. He hung up, feeling a hollow emptiness, the kind that gnawed at him from the inside. Hours passed in a blur. He tried to distract himself with cleaning, picking up old papers and organizing things that did not matter. Nothing filled the gap inside. The grief was a shadow, persistent and unrelenting. He found himself pacing the apartment, gripping the edges of tables and counters as if holding onto reality itself. His mind was a storm of memories and what-ifs, replaying events in endless loops, searching for answers that never came. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. His body was drained, but his mind refused rest. He sat on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to force calm. That's when a knock came at the door. His heart raced. He wasn't expecting anyone. Memories of confrontation and conflict surged through him. He froze, hands tightening into fists, ready for whatever threat might be on the other side. The knocking continued, gentle but insistent. Fear and anticipation battled within him. When he finally opened the door, he found the same police officers from the day before. They had returned, this time with a more serious expression. He felt a surge of panic. Why were they back? Had something gone wrong? The officers spoke softly, explaining that they were concerned for his safety and wanted to make sure he had someone to talk to. Their tone was calm, but to him it sounded like pressure, an invasion of his fragile world. He tried to explain that he was fine, that he could manage alone. His voice trembled as he spoke. He felt judged, exposed, and trapped. The officers asked questions about his day, his feelings, and whether he had any intentions to harm himself. Each question felt like a spotlight on his weaknesses, a reminder that the world saw him as broken. He wanted to scream, to push them away, but he held himself back, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion. The conversation grew tense. He flinched at sudden movements, interpreted neutral gestures as threats, and his responses became sharp, defensive. The police officers, though trying to stay calm, began to realize he was struggling deeply, that his reactions were rooted in grief and trauma rather than aggression. They adjusted their approach, speaking slowly and carefully, but the damage was done. He felt cornered, misunderstood, and more alone than ever. Eventually, the officers decided they could not help him further at that moment and left, leaving him behind with his swirling thoughts and unresolved feelings. The door closed with a soft click, echoing in the emptiness of the apartment. He sank into the couch, trembling, his mind racing. The fear of being judged, misunderstood, or abandoned gnawed at him relentlessly. Hours turned into evening, and he found himself wandering the apartment again. The memories of combat came unbidden. The sounds outside, the rumble of a car, the screech of tires, triggered images of chaos and loss. He felt like he was living two lives, one in the present and one in the past, both painful and relentless. The grief for his lost friend was intertwined with a fear of the world around him, a fear he could not articulate. He thought about reaching out to someone who might understand, but the thought of explaining himself to people who had not shared his experiences seemed impossible. He remembered how in the military trust was earned through shared hardship. Here in the civilian world he had none of that. He was isolated, left to navigate emotions and memories that were too heavy for one person to carry alone. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind a chaotic mix of fear, sorrow, and frustration. The police visits, though well-intentioned, had reminded him of his isolation and the gulf between him and those who had not served. He felt like an outsider in his own life, disconnected from a world that moved on while he remained trapped in grief and tension. In the early hours, he decided to step outside for a walk. The night was calm, the streets empty. The cool air helped a little, grounding him, but it did not erase the storm inside. He walked slowly, feeling each step as a small victory over the weight pressing on him. He thought about the past, about moments with his friend, and about the time when life had felt full of purpose. Those memories were bittersweet, bringing both comfort and pain. As he returned to the apartment, he noticed a small envelope slipped under his door. Curiosity mixed with caution as he picked it up. Inside was a simple note, a message from a veteran support group in the area. They had heard about the police visit and wanted to offer help, understanding, and companionship from those who had shared similar experiences. The words were simple but carried a warmth he had not felt in a long time. They spoke of empathy, patience, and respect, not judgment or authority. He felt a flicker of hope, fragile and tentative. The idea that someone could truly understand him, that there were people who had walked similar paths, was a concept both strange and comforting. He read the note again and again, letting the words sink in. It was not a solution, not a cure, but it was an invitation, a lifeline extended toward him in a world that had often seemed indifferent. In the days that followed, he began to consider reaching out. Each thought was accompanied by doubt and fear, but the idea of connection lingered. He remembered how much he had relied on comrades in the past, how trust and understanding had been crucial to survival. Perhaps, he thought, there could be a way to rebuild some of that support. Even outside the battlefield, the presence of the police, though initially distressing, had been a reminder that he was not entirely invisible. The kindness behind their concern, however imperfectly delivered, was a spark that, combined with the note from the support group, planted the first seeds of change. He realized that help might come from unexpected places, and that not everyone approached with authority intended harm. One evening, he sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. The streets were alive with movement, people going about their lives unaware of the quiet struggles in the apartments above. He thought about the day's events, the tension, the fear, the note of hope. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a small sense of possibility, that there could be understanding, that there could be support, and that perhaps he was not as alone as he had felt. The night deepened, and he returned to bed with a sense of cautious anticipation. Sleep came slowly, but it came, bringing with it dreams that were less chaotic, less filled with fear and loss. The storm inside him did not disappear, but it quieted enough for him to breathe. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he held on to the fragile idea that change was possible, that help could arrive in ways he had not yet imagined, and that his grief, though heavy, did not have to define the rest of his life. A few days after the note arrived, there was another knock at the door. This time it was not the police. He hesitated, unsure if he wanted to answer. But something in the timing felt different, and after a long pause, he opened the door. Standing there were a few men in casual clothing, with a calm presence that felt different from the uniformed authority he had encountered before. There was a familiarity in their eyes, a quiet strength that made him pause. They introduced themselves as members of a veteran support group, people who had served in the military and understood the challenges he faced. He felt a mixture of relief and skepticism. It was hard to believe that strangers could truly understand the depth of his grief and fear, yet there was something genuine in their demeanor, a warmth that was absent in previous encounters. They did not ask probing questions or judge him. Instead, they simply offered their presence and a willingness to listen. He invited them in reluctantly. The apartment, still quiet and heavy with memories, seemed smaller with people inside. The men did not rush or try to fill the silence. They sat patiently, letting him set the pace. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of ease, as if the air had shifted slightly. He realized that he could speak without fear of misunderstanding, that there were people who had shared experiences similar to his own. At first, the conversation was tentative. He spoke in fragments, avoiding the deepest memories, testing the waters to see if they truly understood. The men nodded without judgment, offering stories of their own challenges, losses, and moments of doubt. Hearing their experiences, he felt a connection that words could not fully capture. It was as if the barriers around him began to lower, brick by brick, allowing him to breathe in the possibility of understanding. Over the next few hours, they shared laughter, memories, and small jokes that only someone with a military background could fully appreciate. The atmosphere was calm, supportive, and grounding. He realized that he had been carrying his grief and fear alone for so long, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with people who truly understood him. There was no judgment, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement of shared experiences. As the day turned into evening, they suggested taking a short walk. He agreed, hesitant but curious. The streets were quiet and the air was crisp. They walked slowly, talking about ordinary things at first, food, weather, small details of life that felt safe. Then, gently, they guided the conversation toward deeper topics, the memories of service, the losses endured, and the burdens carried silently. He spoke, hesitated, then spoke again, finding that his words were met with empathy rather than dismissal. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, hope, and fear. Relief that someone could truly understand, sorrow for the losses he carried, hope that healing was possible, and fear that opening up could leave him vulnerable. Yet the men walked beside him without rushing or pressuring. They shared their own vulnerabilities, showing that strength could coexist with pain. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of connection and trust. Returning to the apartment, they continued their conversation over simple meals and tea. The routine, the human presence, and the listening created a safe space he had not experienced in months. He found himself sharing memories of his friend, recounting stories that had been buried under grief. The men listened, sometimes silently, sometimes offering quiet words of acknowledgement. It was not advice or judgment that mattered, but the simple act of being truly heard. As days turned into a week, their visits became a source of stability. They helped him navigate daily life, offering support for tasks he had neglected and gently encouraging him to engage with the world again. They practiced routines together, exercised, and even revisited hobbies he had abandoned. Each small activity was a step toward reclaiming a sense of normalcy. The apartment, once a place of isolation, began to feel less like a prison and more like a space of potential. One afternoon, they introduced him to a local veteran center, a place where others who had served could meet, share, and support one another. He hesitated at first, uncertain if he could face a room full of strangers. But the men reassured him, explaining that connection could come slowly and at his own pace. Stepping into the center, he saw others with similar struggles, scars both visible and hidden. The room was filled with quiet camaraderie, a sense of understanding that felt tangible. He joined small group discussions, listening more than speaking at first. Hearing others recount their experiences, the pain and the victories, created a sense of belonging. Slowly, he began to share his own story, carefully with pauses, and was met with nods, empathy, and acknowledgement. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen and validated, not just as a veteran, but as a human being carrying the weight of grief and trauma. Over time, the visits from the men and the connections at the center became pillars of his healing. They celebrated small victories together, getting through a difficult day, completing a task, or simply sharing a laugh. These moments, small and seemingly ordinary, were monumental to him. They represented steps away from isolation and toward hope. He began to notice changes in himself. The tension in his body eased. The nightmares became less frequent, and the gray monotony of his days was slowly replaced with purpose and engagement. He started opening up to neighbors, exchanging greetings, and participating in small community events. Life outside the apartment, once distant and intimidating, began to feel more approachable. One evening, as he sat with the men in his apartment, he reflected on the journey so far. The confrontation with the police, which had felt like a barrier and a threat, was now a distant memory compared to the warmth and understanding he had found. He realized that support, when rooted in empathy and shared experience, could transform despair into hope. The Marines, as he came to call the men who had entered his life, were not just friends, they were guides helping him navigate the challenging terrain of grief and recovery. He understood that healing would not be linear. There would be days of struggle, memories that would hit unexpectedly, and moments of fear. But now he knew he was not alone. There were people who understood, who could walk beside him, who could offer strength when his own faltered. This realization created a sense of resilience he had not felt in months, a quiet determination to continue moving forward. The presence of the Marines also reminded him of the bonds he had once shared in service. The camaraderie, trust, and shared hardship were not lost. They had simply found a new form in the civilian world. The lessons learned in battle, the resilience forged through adversity, now found purpose in the healing and support of others. This connection, both past and present, became a cornerstone of his recovery. As the days passed, he began to look forward to the visits, the walks, and the conversations. The apartment, once a space of sorrow and isolation, now held laughter, stories, and warmth. He felt a sense of ownership over his healing. Guided but not directed, supported but not controlled. The presence of understanding individuals had begun to fill the void left by loss, replacing fear with trust and despair with hope. One night, as he lay in bed, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of safety, not just physical safety but emotional safety, a place where he could exist without pretense, without the constant burden of expectation or judgment. The Marines had arrived not as authorities but as companions, bridging the gap between isolation and connection. Their presence had changed everything, creating the first steps toward a life that was no longer defined solely by grief, but by the potential for healing and new purpose. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of support from the Marines became a steady rhythm in his life. He woke up each day with a small sense of purpose, something that had been absent for months. The apartment, once a place of shadows and silence, began to feel more like home. Small changes, tidy spaces, fresh coffee, and the smell of a simple meal reflected a shift inside him, a signal that he was beginning to reclaim his life. The Marines were patient guides. They did not rush him or demand openness. They simply offered presence, shared experiences, and gentle encouragement. They helped him organize his days, set small goals, and celebrate even the tiniest achievements. A walk around the block, cooking a meal, or even sitting outside in the sun became milestones in his journey toward normalcy. Each day built upon the last, creating a foundation of stability and trust. He began to open up more during their visits. Stories of his time in service came out in fragments at first, then in fuller sentences. He spoke of his comrade, the friend he had lost, and the memories that haunted him. Tears came, but they were not tears of defeat. They were part of the release he had long denied himself. The Marines listened, sometimes sharing similar stories, sometimes simply sitting quietly, letting him speak. Their understanding required no explanation. They already knew, having walked similar paths themselves. One afternoon, they suggested revisiting his old hobbies, activities he had abandoned since returning home. He hesitated, feeling the weight of disinterest and fear, but agreed. They spent the day fixing a model airplane he had once loved building, sanding, gluing, and painting together. The simple act of creation brought joy he hadn't felt in a long time. Laughter returned to his apartment, a sound that had been absent for months. It was a small, powerful reminder that life could hold light even after darkness. Meals became another point of connection. They cooked together, simple dishes that nourished both body and spirit. Conversations flowed naturally. Memories, plans, fears, and hopes were shared in a space of trust. The aroma of food, the clatter of utensils, and the warmth of company created a sense of community he had thought lost forever. Each interaction built confidence and reinforced the feeling that he could trust again, that he could let people in. Sleep improved gradually. The nightmares that had plagued him, full of chaos and loss, began to fade. When they did appear, he found comfort in the routines the Marines had helped him establish, grounding exercises and breathing techniques that calmed his mind. Waking up no longer felt like stepping into a battlefield. It felt like a gentle continuation of recovery, each day a chance to rebuild himself. The Marines also helped him reconnect with the outside world. They encouraged small steps, saying hello to neighbors, walking in local parks, and attending community events. Each interaction was an exercise in trust, a test of his ability to navigate social spaces after months of isolation. Gradually, he found that people responded positively, that the world was not entirely hostile, and that kindness could exist outside of military camaraderie. At the Veteran Center, he became more engaged. The group welcomed him warmly, and he participated in discussions and activities. Hearing the stories of others, their struggles and triumphs gave him perspective. He realized he was not alone, that many carried wounds invisible to the outside world. Sharing his own experiences created a sense of purpose, helping others feel understood, offering support to those just beginning their journey, and knowing that his presence mattered. One evening, as they sat together after a long day, one of the Marines spoke gently about the future. He didn't pressure him, but suggested ways he could gradually expand his world, volunteering at the center, mentoring new veterans, or even helping organize community events. The idea was both exciting and daunting, but the notion that he could contribute meaningfully to the lives of others sparked a new energy inside him. He also began to explore his emotions more honestly. Anger, sadness, guilt, and grief were no longer hidden beneath layers of suppression. He learned to acknowledge them, to let them exist without being controlled by them. The Marines taught him that strength was not the absence of emotion, but the ability to face it, understand it, and use it as a guide for growth. He felt lighter, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer ruled him. Daily routines were complemented by moments of reflection. Sitting by the window, he watched the sun rise or set, noting small changes in the city below. Birds, trees, the distant chatter of neighbors, all became part of his healing landscape. He began to appreciate the ordinary, finding beauty in moments he had once overlooked. Life outside the shadows of grief was slowly revealing itself, and he was learning to inhabit it fully. The bond with the Marines grew stronger. They were no longer visitors but friends, mentors, and pillars of support. They celebrated milestones together, a completed project, a day without overwhelming memories, a successful outing to a local event. Each victory, no matter how small, reinforced the possibility of healing and the reality that he could trust, rely on, and connect with others. He also began to plan for the long term. The idea of rejoining the workforce, volunteering regularly, or engaging in community service became tangible. The grief and trauma did not vanish, but they were now part of a larger tapestry that included hope, connection, and purpose. He envisioned a life where loss was acknowledged, but did not dictate every action, where memories of his comrade could be honored without preventing him from moving forward. One day, during a quiet moment, he reflected on the contrast between the police visit and the arrival of the Marines. The police, though concerned, had only highlighted his isolation and fear. The Marines, on the other hand, had entered with empathy. Patience and shared experience. They had offered understanding without judgment, presence without pressure. That difference had been life-changing, demonstrating the profound impact of compassion and connection. Over time, he found that he could share his story more openly. Friends at the Veteran Center, neighbors, and even family members began to understand him better. He realized that vulnerability, once terrifying, could be met with empathy rather than judgment. The healing process was ongoing, but he had found the tools, support, and inner strength to navigate it. The apartment, now a place of warmth, reflected his inner journey. Personal projects, photographs of friends, small mementos of happier times, and tokens of progress filled the space. He no longer felt trapped within walls that mirrored his grief. Instead, he inhabited a space where growth, connection, and hope were possible. The Marines continued to guide him, not as authority figures but as companions in his journey. They offered advice, shared experiences, and simply existed as reminders that understanding and support could be found even after profound loss. Their presence reinforced a lesson he had long forgotten. No one has to face trauma alone, and even the heaviest burdens can be lightened by connection, trust, and empathy. As the weeks passed, he began to see a life beyond grief. He could imagine mornings with purpose, evenings with reflection, and days filled with meaningful connection. The memories of his comrade remained honored and cherished, but they no longer consumed him. He felt a sense of balance, a way to carry loss while still living fully. In this transformation, he discovered resilience he had not known he possessed. The Marines had arrived at a moment when he was most vulnerable, and their presence had changed everything. Their patience, understanding, and shared experience provided a bridge from isolation to community, from grief to healing, from despair to hope. And in that bridge, he found the strength to reclaim his life, one day at a time. Months had passed since the Marines first arrived at his door, and the changes in his life were profound. He woke each morning with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. The weight of grief still lingered, but it no longer dictated his every move. He had learned to carry it alongside hope, trust, and connection, creating a balance that allowed him to live fully once again. The veteran had grown close to the Marines, seeing them not only as friends but as pillars of guidance and support. They had taught him that healing is not about erasing pain, but about learning to live with it, to honor the past while embracing the future. Their presence had opened doors to opportunities he had long thought closed, and he was no longer trapped in the isolation that had once defined his days. One of the first steps he took was to become actively involved in the local veteran center. He began mentoring new veterans, sharing his experiences, and offering support in ways that were once unimaginable to him. He discovered that helping others also helped him heal. When he listened to their stories, offered guidance, or simply sat quietly with someone in pain, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The connections he built were genuine and meaningful, providing both support and inspiration. His home, once a quiet, lonely place, was now filled with signs of life and activity. Projects he had abandoned were resumed, and new hobbies flourished. Small daily routines became rituals of self-care and progress. Morning coffee, walks in the park, and conversations with neighbors all became part of a tapestry that reflected a life reclaimed from grief. He found joy in simple pleasures once again, understanding that healing often begins with small, consistent steps. The bond with the Marines deepened over shared experiences and mutual understanding. They celebrated milestones together, both large and small. A successful community event, a productive day at the Veteran Center, or even a quiet afternoon spent on hobbies, were all acknowledged as victories. These moments reinforced the understanding that healing was a process, one that required patience, consistency, and support. He also reconnected with family members he had grown distant from. Sharing his journey, his struggles, and the steps he had taken to heal allowed them to understand him in ways they could not before. Relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding and distance began to mend. He learned that communication, honesty, and vulnerability were essential tools for rebuilding trust and connection, both with himself and with those around him. Community involvement became a significant part of his new life. He began volunteering at local events, participating in charity drives, and helping organize activities for other veterans. Each act, though seemingly small, reinforced a sense of purpose and belonging. He realized that the skills, discipline, and resilience he had honed in service could now serve a new purpose, benefiting others and fostering meaningful connections. Emotionally, he had transformed. The anger, guilt, and despair that had once consumed him were now tempered by understanding, patience, and resilience. He had learned to acknowledge his feelings without being controlled by them. He allowed himself to grieve, to remember, and to honor those he had lost, but he no longer allowed the pain to define his existence. This emotional growth created a foundation for a life that balanced past experiences with present possibilities. The veteran also found peace in solitude. Alone time was no longer a source of fear or despair, but a chance for reflection, creativity, and personal growth. He filled his apartment with meaningful activities, books, and projects that nurtured both mind and spirit. Moments of quiet became opportunities to recharge, reflect, and reconnect with the inner strength that had carried him through his darkest times. Over time, he began to envision a long-term future filled with purpose and contribution. He considered further education, more active involvement in veteran programs, and even public speaking to share his journey and inspire others. These goals, once distant dreams, became tangible steps that gave his days structure and meaning. Each day, each action, reinforced the understanding that he was capable of growth, connection, and positive impact. One afternoon, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The initial police visit, which had been shocking and overwhelming, now seemed like a pivotal point, a reminder that help could come in many forms and that understanding sometimes requires patience and the right connection. The arrival of the Marines had been the turning point, their empathy, patience, and shared experience transforming fear and isolation into trust and hope. It was a lesson he would carry with him forever, that support, understanding, and genuine connection can change lives. He also realized that healing was not a solitary process. The network of people around him, the Marines, friends from the Veteran Center, neighbors, and family, provided a web of support that allowed him to flourish. Each relationship, nurtured with care and empathy, strengthened his resilience and reinforced the possibility of a fulfilling life. He understood that asking for help, trusting others, and building connections were acts of strength, not weakness. The veteran now looked forward to each day with anticipation rather than dread. He engaged with life fully, appreciating both the challenges and the joys it offered. He celebrated successes, faced difficulties with resilience, and approached relationships with openness and empathy. Life had become a dynamic journey, rich with opportunities for growth, connection, and fulfillment. His grief for his lost comrade remained, but it had transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing force, but a memory honored through action, purpose, and remembrance. He kept small tokens of memory, photographs, letters, or personal mementos, using them as reminders of the bond he had shared and the strength that bond had instilled. The pain was acknowledged, but balanced by the joy, purpose, and connection he had cultivated. He also discovered the joy of helping others find their way. Whether through mentoring, volunteering, or simply offering a listening ear, he became a source of strength for others navigating their own challenges. This role gave him a profound sense of fulfillment, reinforcing the understanding that personal healing and helping others could coexist, each enhancing the other. Over time, the veteran began to recognize the full scope of his transformation. From isolation and despair, he had moved to connection, purpose, and hope. The journey had been neither quick nor easy, but each step, guided by patience, empathy, and shared experience, had brought him closer to a life filled with meaning and possibility. The presence of the Marines, their unwavering support, and the network he had built had been instrumental in this transformation. As he reflected on his journey, he understood that life was a series of choices, connections, and moments that could shape the future in profound ways. The path had been difficult, filled with grief, fear, and doubt, but it had also been illuminated by understanding, patience, and the kindness of those who truly cared. He had learned that healing is possible, that resilience can be nurtured, and that connection can transform lives. In the final moments of reflection, he recognized the profound truth that had guided his journey. No one has to face their struggles alone. With the right support, understanding, and empathy, even the deepest grief can be navigated and a fulfilling life can be rebuilt. The Marines had arrived at the right moment, their presence changing everything, guiding him toward a life where hope, connection, and purpose could flourish.